In the world of mixed martial arts, few names carry the weight and myth of Khabib Nurmagomedov, the undefeated champion whose record of 29-0 became more than a number. It became a warning. From the rugged mountains of Dagestan to the global spotlight of UFC, he dismantled opponents with a discipline so relentless that analysts began calling him the most inevitable fighter alive. Every takedown felt like gravity, every round seemed predetermined, and every victory pushed his legend further beyond reach. Yet behind the dominance was a man shaped by culture, loss, pressure, and a level of global influence no organization could fully control. And as his popularity exploded across Russia, the Middle East, and Europe, so did the complications around him: religion, politics, family expectations, and the growing tension between what the UFC wanted and what Khabib believed in. Then came the moment that shocked the world. The night he walked away at the height of his power. Fans called it noble, critics called it reckless, and the UFC quietly realized it had just lost its most irreplaceable champion. Why would the most dominant fighter of his era choose to step away when no one on earth had ever defeated him? And what truth lies beneath the victories, the scandals, and the silence he left behind? To understand that, we must return to the beginning, where the story of Khabib truly began. The story of Khabib Nurmagomedov begins far from the bright lights of Las Vegas, in the harsh, mountainous terrain of Sildi, Dagestan, where discipline was not a choice, but a way of survival. Growing up in a region marked by conflict and tradition, Khabib was shaped by an environment where strength, humility, and endurance were expected from childhood. His father, Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov, a revered coach and military veteran, became the architect of his destiny. Under Abdulmanap's relentless system, Khabib trained in wrestling at age 5, learned judo by 12, and mastered combat sambo soon after, building a foundation that blended raw Dagestani toughness with technical brilliance. While other children played in schoolyards, Khabib spent hours on cold mats, drilling the same movements until they were instincts stitched into his muscles. By the time he turned 20, he had already accumulated an undefeated record across regional promotions, dominating with a style so suffocating that commentators began questioning whether anyone his size could survive his pressure. When he entered UFC in 2012, few in the West knew his name, but insiders warned that something unstoppable had arrived. His early victories ragdolling opponents like Gleison Tibau, Thiago Tavares, and later dismantling Rafael dos Anjos, announced a new era in the lightweight division. Analysts noted his trademark control, a chain wrestling pressure that pinned elite fighters to the canvas as if gravity had grown heavier under him. As his streak reached 20-0, then 25-0, and finally the championship belt, whispers grew louder. Was Khabib the most dominant lightweight the sport had ever seen? Media outlets across Russia and the Middle East hailed him as a national hero, while UFC fans began treating him as a phenomenon rather than just a contender. His ascent seemed faultless, even destined, a flawless blueprint of discipline meeting opportunity. But beneath the perfection was a world the public rarely saw one, shaped by cultural tension, personal sacrifice, and a system of values that didn't always fit the demands of global entertainment. And as Khabib's star rose higher, the forces around him, political expectations, media narratives, and UFC's own ambitions grew even stronger, pushing him toward the first major clash of his career. Because dominance alone couldn't shield him from what was coming next, and the clean, unstoppable rise of Khabib Nurmagomedov was about to collide with a reality far more chaotic than anything he faced inside the cage. For years, the rise of Khabib Nurmagomedov felt unstoppable, a straight upward trajectory, powered by discipline and dominance. But that illusion shattered on the night of the 6th of October 2018 at UFC 229, when the biggest fight in lightweight history spiraled into chaos that no one, not the UFC, not Nevada regulators, not even Khabib himself could control. The rivalry with Conor McGregor had already escalated far beyond promotion, fueled by insults about religion, family, and nationality, creating a level of tension that made the octagon feel less like a sports arena and more like a geopolitical battleground. when Khabib submitted McGregor in the 4th round, securing the most important victory of his career. The world expected celebration. Instead, they witnessed a moment that would forever define him. Khabib leaped over the cage, charging at Dillon Danis, igniting a brawl that spread through the arena in seconds. Security scrambled, punches flew, and millions watching the broadcast saw a champion lose control on the biggest night of his life. The aftermath was even more explosive. The Nevada Athletic Commission withheld his $2 million purse, suspended him for months, and fined him $500,000, the largest disciplinary penalty of his career. For the UFC, the incident was both a disaster and a goldmine. It broke PPV records, surpassing 2.4 million buys, but it also forced the organization into a delicate dance between discipline and dependence. Publicly, they condemned the violence. Privately, they knew the chaos had only made Khabib's star even larger. Yet this was only the beginning of the complications surrounding him. Beyond the cage, Khabib's loyalty to Dagestan, his outspoken views on religion and culture, and his refusal to bend to entertainment-first expectations created friction with the UFC, which often favored showmanship over tradition. His absence during McGregor's infamous bus attack incident earlier that year, when Conor threw a metal dolly through a bus window targeting Khabib's team, further fueled a narrative of escalating hostility between two worlds colliding. And while the UFC leaned into the drama to promote their biggest event ever, Khabib never played along. He treated the feud as personal, not promotional, something that only intensified the consequences when chaos finally erupted. After UFC 229, broadcasters debated whether Khabib was a hero defending his honor or a liability too unpredictable for the UFC to control. The truth was somewhere in between. His cultural background viewed loyalty and respect as sacred, and when those values were challenged, he reacted with an intensity that Western media sometimes misinterpreted. Yet that complexity also made him impossible to ignore. Every controversy, every clash with regulators, every tension point with the UFC added layers to his public image, transforming him from a dominant fighter into a polarizing global figure. The scandals didn't weaken his legacy, they amplified it. Still, behind the headlines was a deeper, more uncomfortable reality. Khabib's controversies were no longer just emotional reactions. They were exposing the UFC's dependence on him and the growing power imbalance between fighter and organization. And as the world tried to make sense of the chaos, one question became unavoidable. If scandal alone could not slow him down, what force truly shaped the future of his career? The answer, as always, came down to power and the vast amounts of money surrounding his name. Long before his retirement, the world had already realized that Khabib Nurmagomedov was more than just an athlete. He was an economic engine capable of shifting markets, breaking records, and opening entire regions to the UFC. By the time he reached his championship years, estimates placed his net worth between $40 million and $60 million, a number that didn't merely reflect fight purses, but a global phenomenon built around his identity, discipline, and undefeated mystique. His biggest payday came from UFC 229, where he earned more than $8 million, including bonuses and pay-per-view cuts, and that was only the official figure. The UFC rarely discloses full back-end earnings, but analysts believe his actual share was significantly higher because the event sold over 2.4 million PPVs, the highest in the company's history. That single night cemented his financial leverage within the organization. Even after fines and suspensions, Khabib emerged more valuable than ever. Outside the octagon, his business empire expanded rapidly. He became the face of major sponsors across Russia, the Middle East, and Central Asia, representing airlines, telecom companies, energy groups, and lifestyle brands that understood the power of a disciplined Muslim champion adored across multiple continents. His influence stretched far beyond MMA. Stadiums filled when he appeared, national leaders invited him as a guest of honor, and every public speech triggered millions of views online. When he launched Eagle FC, he shifted from athlete to executive, building a promotion that aimed to rival established organizations in Russia and eventually expand globally. For the UFC, this was both impressive and unsettling. They had built their empire on fighters who depended on the organization for relevance. Khabib reversed the dynamic. His presence brought the UFC massive attention from markets previously difficult to enter, most importantly, the Muslim world, where his humility and religious discipline made him not just a star but a cultural icon. And because no one in the lightweight division could match his drawing power, his fights carried enormous financial risk. Canceling them meant losing millions, and replacing him was almost impossible. He didn't negotiate like a typical contender. He negotiated like someone who understood his worth. When he refused to return after Abdulmanap's death, the UFC pushed, pleaded, and hinted at historic paydays because they knew that without Khabib, their expansion into key markets slowed dramatically. Every number tied to him: PPVs, viewers, sponsorships, international deals painted the same picture. Khabib wasn't part of the UFC economy. He was one of the pillars holding it up. The financial power he accumulated made him untouchable in ways few athletes ever become. And that power explains a deeper truth. While scandals might have shaken his image, money safeguarded his influence, shaping the UFC's decisions around him. Yet behind all the numbers was a more personal, more fragile side of Khabib's life, one that the public rarely saw because the story of his wealth and success was inseparable from the pressures and contradictions waiting outside the cage. Away from the roar of arenas and the bright lights of Las Vegas, the world of Khabib Nurmagomedov looked entirely different. Quieter, stricter, shaped by the values of Dagestan and the legacy of his father Abdulmanap. While global fame painted him as an untouchable champion, those close to him knew a man who lived by a rigid personal code, guided by faith, family, and discipline that bordered on ascetic. Unlike many fighters who embraced the chaotic lifestyle that accompanies celebrity status, Khabib avoided nightlife, luxury showcases, and the temptations that often derail careers. Yet fame has a way of reaching even the most guarded individuals. As his influence grew across Russia, Europe, and the Middle East, he became a cultural symbol whose every action was magnified. A simple photo, a comment, a public appearance, anything could ignite conversation. His dedication to Islamic principles meant living under constant scrutiny, balancing the expectations of millions who saw him not just as an athlete, but as an example. Then came the defining personal loss, the death of Abdulmanap in 2020. It shattered the emotional foundation on which his entire career had been built. Abdulmanap wasn't just his father, he was his coach, strategist, and the man who engineered every stage of his development. Without him, Khabib's victories no longer felt complete. Privately, he spoke about the emptiness that settled after each win, how triumph no longer carried the same meaning, how stepping into the cage without his father's guidance felt like betraying the purpose behind everything they had built. Publicly, he maintained composure. Privately, he struggled with the increasing weight of expectations. Fans demanded dominance, the UFC demanded title defenses, and nations demanded representation. He became a man pulled in every direction: fighter, son, leader, role model, businessman, yet still expected to uphold the humility and composure of a monk. Those who traveled with him during this period described the paradox: unmatched global fame paired with a deep personal isolation. Everywhere he went, he was celebrated, yet he longed for the simplicity of his early life in Dagestan. The pressure intensified after his father's passing, with the UFC pushing for one more fight, one more defense, one more massive payday. But Khabib's internal compass didn't point toward money or legacy. It pointed toward loyalty, faith, and responsibility to his family. That conflict between global superstardom and deeply rooted personal values became the quiet battle that shaped the final chapter of his career. And as all these forces converged, one truth grew impossible to ignore. In a sport where athletes often become replaceable the moment they lose, Khabib's significance extended far beyond competition, which leads to the question the UFC never wanted to confront directly: why they feared losing him more than any champion before him. For all the dominance and discipline that defined Khabib Nurmagomedov, his true power within the UFC came from something far more valuable than an undefeated record. It came from his ability to move global markets in a way no lightweight champion before him ever had. By the time he defended his title against Conor McGregor, Dustin Poirier, and Justin Gaethje, the numbers surrounding him had become staggering. His fights consistently drew millions of viewers across Russia, the Middle East, Europe, and even regions where the UFC had historically struggled to gain traction. Every appearance triggered spikes in subscriptions, social media engagement, and pay-per-view sales. The company wasn't just promoting a fighter, they were leaning on an international phenomenon who brought entire countries with him every time he walked into the octagon. What made him irreplaceable wasn't just popularity, it was the scale. No other fighter had ever united such a massive global audience under one name. While the UFC had stars like McGregor, Rousey, and Jones, none of them commanded the loyalty of an entire cultural and religious community the way Khabib did. His fan base wasn't merely large, it was anchored in identity, faith, and pride. That kind of support isn't bought or manufactured, it's inherited, and it's almost impossible for the UFC to replicate through traditional promotion. Then there was the competitive landscape. The lightweight division historically boasted talent, but none offered the aura of inevitability that followed Khabib. The UFC could build contenders, but it couldn't manufacture a fighter with his style. Relentless pressure, flawless grappling, and a record of 29-0 that made every matchup feel like a historic event. Without him, the division lost its axis. Championships continued, but the sense of an era disappeared. And the UFC knew this. Behind closed doors, executives pushed for one more fight, one more headline event, one more chance to capture the momentum he generated. They offered unprecedented paydays, legacy opportunities, and even floated the possibility of super fights, because they understood the truth. The UFC needed Khabib more than he needed the UFC. His retirement in 2020, announced in tears after defeating Justin Gaethje, sent shockwaves through the organization, not because champions don't retire, but because champions with this level of global influence almost never walk away at their peak. Khabib did, and he did it on his terms. The UFC feared losing him because no marketing strategy could replace the cultural gravity he brought. He wasn't just a star, he was a shift in the sport's global trajectory. And once he stepped away, the UFC faced the uncomfortable question they had spent years avoiding. What happens when the most influential fighter in the world doesn't need the octagon anymore? In the end, the legacy of Khabib Nurmagomedov is defined not only by the perfection of his 29-0 record, but by the contradictions that shaped every chapter of his journey. He was the unstoppable champion who walked away while still at the top, the global superstar who rejected fame, the financial powerhouse who refused to be controlled by money, and the fighter who valued family, faith, and loyalty more than any belt the UFC could offer. His story is a mosaic of dominance and restraint, chaos and discipline, triumph and tragedy, all held together by a man who never allowed the world to define him. As analysts debate where he ranks among the greatest of all time, a deeper question lingers beneath the numbers. What would the sport look like today if Khabib had chosen to stay? Would new legends have risen the same way? Would the lightweight division still orbit around his unbeaten shadow? Or did his departure create a void that no champion has fully filled since? His influence extends far beyond trophies and statistics. It lives in the way young fighters across Dagestan, Russia, and the Middle East train, dream, and measure themselves against the impossible standard he created. And perhaps that is the true paradox of Khabib's story. His career ended, but his presence never left. The question now is not how he will be remembered, but how long the sport will continue to evolve under the weight of a man who stepped away, yet still shapes the future from the outside.